I'm Indy Neidell.
I'm Spartacus Olsson.
And this is another thrilling Time Goes World War II fireside chat where we sit here and that guy,
Sebastian Brandstetter,
asks us questions about the Second World War. Now, last time we were supposed to do a bunch of talking about like the later part of 1940, but we ended up just talking about the Battle of Britain, basically.
Yep.
So you have some other questions about that period that
yes,
you're going to ask?
I do.
Okay.
Do not worry, do not threaten.
Okay, shoot.
So we're going to talk about China, Japan, the Far East in general, right? First question is, the war in China is reaching something of a stalemate by 1939, 1940, right? Had Japan already overreached in China by 1939?
Japan had overreached in China by the first week of invading China. I mean,
China's huge.
yeah, but they, with Manchukuo and the whole stuff in the 30s, I know the Japanese thought that it would be a much quicker war, but you have all that land. But here in 1940, now after the fall of France, Japan is now trying to strangle China economically since they're having trouble beating them militarily. So after the fall of France, they've invaded Indochina because the French couldn't do anything about it. And they are making threats over Burma to the British to close the Burma Road. So strangling the supplies to China will theoretically win the war along with their military might. That's the plan.
And they're also facing a very difficult situation because of the asymmetrical warfare being fought by the Chinese, and they're having a difficult time moving forward because of that. And they choose atrocity, or terror, I should say, as a response to it. But it's a period that we know very little about because both sides have muddied the waters and not really divulged what happened. But in respect to your question, are they overstretched? Yes, because of that as well. So we've got land, we've also got
because they're resource overstretched, and this is a little foreshadowing leading to what will become a wider war, especially with the U.S. like now more and more hesitant to supply Japan with oil, and them having to turn to the Dutch and the Dutch East Indies and buying things when you could just take it, and what will become a hard embargo. And this in 1941, obviously, this becomes a big play. So Japan needs resources, and it's looking out elsewhere for resources. It still has the military edge, obviously. It's got a better army than either the Chinese Nationalists or the Chinese Communists. But it's not so much of a stalemate as a morass.
Yeah.
So
slow going, tough going.
It's bogged down. That's what it is.
Yeah.
Because this is one of the things that we saw in the comments a lot, both in Indy's episodes and mine, that we didn't cover enough of what was going on in Japan. In China with Japan. We covered as much as we can, and we covered all of the essential bits for sure. But between the actual events, between the battles, between the acts of terror, between the bombing campaigns taking off and slowing down, it's just a really long drudgery of death, of people fighting in this asymmetric warfare and on the front lines that the Japanese are holding, and they move. It's very
and
similar.
A paucity of material, the paucity of records, and the records there are, particularly with the communists, but also with the nationalists, are the official record, which means you did great.
Yeah, pretty much. So. And so there is a lot of happening from an individual perspective. From somebody who's stuck in the middle of all of this, there's daily fighting. It's going on all the time. It's just not leading anywhere. It's more similar to the First World War than it is to the Second World War in that respect, that you don't have a stalemate, but you have an unchanging front.
It's interesting, though, that we're talking about this late 1940. We're actually talking about, although, the World War is the World War. They're all parts of the same war. But, the actual tripartite Axis, the full-on Axis, isn't until October when Japan joins the Axis officially. So then you officially have it in War One war. That's just a side note that struck me, that just hit me.
Okay, let's go to Wang Jingwei.
Okay.
Traitor or pragmatist?
Come on. I mean,
first
of all, a lot of traders think they are being pragmatists. That's why they're traders. Is they say, well, this is obviously the best thing for me to do for myself. And so I cannot see collaboration with the Japanese and putting yourself under the Japanese thumb ever possibly turning into a good thing for the Chinese, whom the Japanese consider racially inferior. It's not going to go well. I mean, if all of China was under Wang Jingwei's puppet regime from Nanning under the Japanese, it would not go well for the Chinese. They would. It's not going well for them now anyway with this massive war. But still, I would. Sure, I say go for. If I have to pick, say traitor.
I'd agree with that, but it raises a question in my mind: what is China?
Okay.
We're not talking about a China. We're talking about many Chinas, because we have a civil war that is only paused, and it hasn't really paused because they're still kind of fighting each other.
There are still warlord-run regions, and there's a loose network of them under Chiang, which is why he has to tolerate corruption from his officers, because if he says no, they'll just say, fine, I'm taking my army and going somewhere else.
So although I agree with Indy that Wang Jingwei has to be labeled as a traitor, the question is, what was he a traitor against, right?
And for those who don't know who Wang Jingwei was, he was the guy that was in charge of the Japanese puppet regime from Nanning in the territory that they had taken since invading China.
Okay, moving on from Wang Jingwei. How much fighting did the communists actually do against the Japanese?
In 1940?
Weren't they just sitting safe
the
up in
100
Yan'an?
Regiments Offensive in 1940. This is the biggest fighting they've done. If the war ended right, if I didn't know what was going to happen after 1940, I'd go, wow, the communists are really, really trying to shoulder their burden, because they are trying to shoulder their burden. Peng Dehuai, who we'll see later in Korea. The thing about the fighting, and this is important, there's an episode, a World War II episode from October 1940, I don't remember which date, when I tell the story of a battle from the 100 Regiments Offensive. And I have to tell it from three different perspectives: the Chinese Communist perspective, the Nationalist perspective, and the Japanese perspective, because they're all completely different. They don't even agree on who won the battle. And that illustrates the problem we have with China. As far as I'm aware, fighting the 100 Regiments Offensive and really trying to break the Japanese rail and road monopoly, which would cripple the Japanese war effort. I mean, that's a noble goal. They don't have the force to do it. And it goes very disastrously for the Chinese communists. Knowing the future, I know they will not have another big offensive like that really until the end of the war, until they won't start fighting again until 1945. Because of such a loss like this, and they will be husbanding their strength while Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists have to shoulder the burden of the war.
That leads into the second part of the question, what you just said. Could you then say that after the 100 Regiments Offensive, they were kind of biding their time, preparing for a civil war?
They weren't kind of, they were.
Okay, cool. That was a straight up answer.
They were up in Hubei. They were up there. They had their two provinces that were solidly locked in, So.
That's what I meant with what China are you talking about, right? You don't have a China. And on top of the absolutely gigantic territory that we're looking at, there are other issues here, which are communication, logistics, and everything that goes into that. This is a terrible front to be on for anyone.
Yeah.
Because you don't really know what's going on at the other end. It takes real long time for people to find out what the other guys are doing. And you're not friends with them because you're fighting them in another war. So in many ways, we can fault them for that, and we can agree or disagree with the cause of Mao Zedong and the communists. I happen to disagree vehemently with what they were doing, but that's another issue. Whatever you think of what they were doing, retreating into a position of safety to build your strength was a very reasonable thing, because it's also a question of concentrating your forces in if you look at the map, right? You just look at one of our maps and you follow the front line of the war there. It's spotty. It looks like a labyrinth of things going up and down. Suddenly you have a Japanese enclave that is completely cut off from the rest. You got the communists spread out in 1,000 places. You've got the nationalists spread out in 1,000 places. You've got these long tongues of Japanese infiltration along
all these
the
little
railroad.
Coastal bits and stuff too.
And then you've got the railroad lines where they could follow. It's a really difficult war to coordinate.
And even the nationalists are like many different factions.
Yes,
which Chiang is trying to, for better or worse, holding together.
Talking about the nationalists, was Chiang taking baby steps towards democratizing China, or was the description by American observers of increasingly fascist-like tendencies more apt description.
Most descriptions of what Chiang was doing by any foreign observer tended to be unfair because they were based on what they wanted Chiang to do for their country, not what they wanted Chiang to do for China. I mean, Chiang was acting for China, in the end. As I said, a lot of what Chiang had was a bunch of the former warlords, many of whom were weakened, many of whom were still fairly strong. That's where a lot of his army came from. That's where a big part of his army came from, other than his own conscriptions. And tying them together, it'd be tough having it be leaning towards democracy and giving them an equal vote in running the country, because they wouldn't. They'd be for themselves. It was a real tightrope walk to put it together. Now, one thing that Mao and the communists did not have to do, because they didn't have to deal with anything like that, and they could make money since they were not ideologically constrained by things like Christianity, which Chiang was a Christian. So they could run an opium trade and a heroin trade and make money to pay for all their stuff by that. Chiang actually refused that. Had he done that, he would have alienated a lot of foreign people, but he would have made a lot more local money. So he had to deal with seizures. He had to deal with bad harvests. He had to deal with disappointing farmers every single year, particularly in 1940 when there were bad harvests.
The question is a bit, how should I say, malicious, in as much as that it presupposes that we live in a black and white world where there are evil people and good people. Evil people who are opposed to democracy and good people who are for democracy. It's a much grayer scale than that. And also, even if in retrospect, we can definitely say Mao was trying to build a totalitarian regime, and what Chiang did after the war in Taiwan didn't look very good. So we could say, okay, that's evidence that they were all going towards a totalitarian system, both on the communist and on the nationalist side. But, you have to see it from their perspective as well. Mao, in all his potential evilness, believed that he was doing something good for the people, and that his version of democracy, which is then a people's republic and all of that, that's what he was fighting for. Chiang was doing the same thing, right? He was looking at it from a perspective of, this is the best thing I can do from China. I disagree with both, but that's me. So the question is framed as if there was a and B alternative, and in their minds, there wasn't, right? It's not, oh, I'm going to do this or I'm going to do that. They were just trying to do what they thought was the best, which it wasn't, but that doesn't really come into play if we're looking at their motivations.
You also have to think about Chiang's frustration. I mean, if you look at the mid-30s, he was modernizing and consolidating China quite well. He was doing a great job before the Japanese invasion. Had the Japanese waited until 1939 or 1940 or not invaded, there would have been no Mao and the communists. The communists were nearly stamped out by 1937. But that could not be finished because of, obviously, the war. And now you have to deal with that, which becomes, obviously, the greater threat in the end.
So, yeah, no, without a doubt. In the end, and I mean, it goes into what we keep on saying, and what you coined, history doesn't happen in a vacuum. Right. It's not like somebody goes into this situation with a plan and that is the plan that is fulfilled. This is the illusion of the great leaders like Stalin, Hitler, Mao, Chiang, whatever, which one ever you want to have. They have this illusion that I have a manifest destiny that I can fulfill, and I can do it if I just do this, right? But then there are a million other things that happen at the same time. And as Clausewitz so cleverly said, no plan survives contact with the enemy. And here it is exactly that.
I like you're putting my quote up there with Clausewitz. History doesn't happen in a vacuum. No plan survives contact with the enemy. That's me and Clausewitz. Boom. Yeah.
So you have this situation where, they have this vision for what they are going to fulfill. And then somebody else does something else. And that is exactly what happens when Japan falls into Manchuria, and suddenly Chiang's ideas of stomping out communism are dead in the water.
One last question about the nationalists. The Japanese regularly made overtures to the nationalists in China, saying that if they surrendered, they'd be treated favorably.
What does favorably mean?
Or
Oh,
they
does
would be
it means they won't be murdered? Because
well-
that's not necessarily favorable. Favorable compared to what?
Question. He's questioning Japan.
I mean, I'm saying compared
Yeah.
to what? They would not be favorable compared to other of the inferior races that Japan thought they were fighting in, or going to fight in Southeast Asia. Favorable. Would they be treated equally with Japanese citizens? No. No, they would not.
I mean, you can disagree with any of the sides. You can disagree with the communists. You can disagree with the nationalists. But you cannot disagree with the fact that they were fighting an enemy who was hell-bent on subjugating anyone who was Chinese. So picking up that bait would be treason. And that's what getting
Wang
back to
Jingwei.
Wang Jingwei. Yeah.
Yeah.
Long story short, there was no real prospect of an agreement between the nationalists and the
They could
Japanese.
agree to be subjects to Japan.
Now, you also have to put this against the backdrop of what the Japanese are doing in China and what the people are seeing them doing.
Yeah.
And it's terrible. We have the rape of Nanking. We have all of the little smaller, smaller, there still is atrocious atrocities and terror committed. We've got terror bombing. We've got all of these things going on. But there's also another thing that's going on right now in 1940 that started earlier than that has only really come to light now in the 21st century because both sides didn't want to talk about it. Well, in China, it kind of disappeared into the Civil War. And that is the biological warfare that the Japanese are carrying out on
Which
on
we've
the
covered,
Chinese.
sure.
We've covered this in War Against Humanity, and you've mentioned it as well. And we really didn't know much about it until the beginning of this century, when a Chinese survivor brought a lawsuit against Japan, filing for damages. And although we still only have spotty records and we don't know what went on exactly, the initial estimates by foreigners was that a few 100,000 people had died by the biological warfare carried out and created by Unit 731 and then released by the Imperial Japanese Army. And now it looks like we're talking about of magnitude more people that died from diseases deliberately created by Unit 731 and the IJA. We're talking about potentially 5 million people that died in this way. And the Chinese are seeing this all the time. They live with this. They live with the atrocities committed against them. They live with the starvation that the war is carrying, that the war is creating from both sides. And they live with the disease.
And they're going to hear about this. The Japanese can't just do any of this without any local Chinese working with them and help collaborating with them. They're still going to tell their friends what's going on.
Yeah.
You know.
So coming back to the question, did it make sense to believe any of that? No way. The Japanese actions in China were absolutely horrendous.
Let's move theaters.
Okay.
We're moving to the west or east, depending which way around the globe you want to go,
Okay.
to the cradle of humanity. So North Africa. Well, North Africa isn't the cradle of humanity, but the continent of Africa
Sure.
is.
All right.
Okay.
Roll with it.
Roll with it.
Okay.
Okay. Would Germany have become involved in the North African campaign if Italy hadn't suffered the initial defeat?
Well, who doesn't want to have the cradle of humanity?
Yeah. That's an interesting question. You can think eventually. I mean, Germany. We're in 1940. Germany had its hands full. The Africa Corps is not deployed to North Africa until 1941. Anyway, that's after everything in Greece and Operation Compass and stuff like that. After the Italian defeats. I mean, Hitler. Except for Greece, Hitler was like, okay, sure, North Africa, do North Africa. Obviously, taking control of the Red Sea or the Mediterranean would have crippled the British war effort, but in September, October, November, they thought they were already crippling the British war effort. I mean, they weren't really worried about the British fleet at the moment. The Germans weren't worrying about that. So that's for the future. I really can't say if they would have gotten involved. It depends what kind of success they had. If Italy had done nothing, that had not invaded Greece, had done nothing in North Africa, I don't know. Maybe at some point Hitler would have encouraged them to do that. I mean, then the Germans had to go and help out in Greece because that was Britain's only continental ally after, by late 1940. It's funny when you think about it. They had only one ally left and it was Greece. And from Greece, you can reach the Ploiești oil fields in Romania, which supplied the German war machine. So, of course, Hitler was worried about that, hence having to deal with Greece and Yugoslavia on the way. I can't say if he had any big plans. No, I can't say. If he had big plans for the Red Sea or for... There were the plans to go... There were the Gibraltar plans, right? There were the plans to send divisions to take Gibraltar, the Straits of Gibraltar, and blockade that end of the Mediterranean, which Canaris had a large part in defeating by explaining to Franco how this would never work. The problem with Franco...
Canaris is the head of the Abwehr.
Sorry if I'm hopping around. We've talked about him before.
Potentially was a traitor or a patriot.
Depending how you look
There's
at
a
it.
cool book about it.
There's a book that Sebastian worked on a lot. We all worked on it. We wrote the foreword, Traitor Patriots. Check it out. It's on Amazon.
There'll be a link below. Important to look at Franco then, here in 1940, in the fall of 1940. Of course, Hitler and Mussolini wanted Franco as an ally. Hitler couldn't stand Franco, but that's an ally is an ally. But Franco was very clear that he would not join the Axis powers until Britain had been invaded or defeated or at least invaded. The reason being that it was the U.S. and Britain were supplying a lot of the food that the Spanish required. I mean, they had the war in Spain, Spanish Civil War, had done a lot of damage to the Spanish economy, and it was the U.S. and Britain that were propping them up. And joining the Axis would have meant goodbye to that. Right? So Franco was pretty clear that, okay, I understand you want to take Gibraltar from the British, great, cool. You want to take the other side, great, cool. First you have to deal with Britain, and then go ahead.
I mean, if there's any piece of evidence that shows that Germany would not have gotten involved if the Italians would not have lost, then it is the harsh debate going on inside of the Wehrmacht about how necessary or unnecessary a fight in North Africa is.
Yeah.
It was by no means a popular event.
No.
And many of the leadership on the German side were heavily opposed to sending material and men into a theater that had nothing to do with the actual soon-to-be war with the Russians.
This whole fall, they've already sent 35 divisions to Romania. You don't need 35 divisions to protect Romania as an ally or protect the oil fields. You only need 35 divisions there if you're going to attack someone like the Soviet Union from Romania. Yeah. They're already doing, it's starting in July is when July 1940, when the initial Barbarossa plans began being developed. They're already moving force east the whole autumn.
And this was very much, by actually I would say even a majority of the Wehrmacht leadership, it was seen as a distraction, by some maybe as a necessary distraction, but it was not a popular move to go into North Africa.
Moving on to a bit of a different subject, how noble or ignoble was the North African campaign really compared to the others? Because
in 1940...
40-41.
Well, okay. Well, the Africa Corps gets there in 41, but okay, I thought we were really 1940. 1940, it's just the same war as anybody else. It's the Italians and the British and fighting over Somaliland, and we talked about this. You talked about this in one of your things. It's not there's no real. It's not a noble struggle. I mean, okay, someone's trying to take over Egypt so they can control the Red Sea. There's nothing noble in taking that out. It's noble to defend your homeland or your territory, sure, but I don't see why that would be any more noble than France defending France or anybody defending themselves, right?
It's also the idea that there is such a thing as a noble war. When we're talking about the practical side of it, forget about defense is a noble thing. Standing up for and protecting civilians is a noble thing. There's no question about that. And defeating powers that want to subjugate and kill people is a noble cause, without a question. But the actual negotiation of a war lacks all nobility, because it's blood and guts, and it's people killing each other.
And there's no escaping that.
No, and if you can dress it up, you can say, okay, they were more polite while killing each other than they were in North Africa. But does that really make it noble? No, it makes it maybe a little bit less insufferable.
That's what I was also, very interesting points both of you raised, but I think that's what the question was more gearing towards is, how often, especially Rommel and the relationship between the belligerence in North Africa is contrasted to the rest of the world. It's like it seems almost taken out of time. It's a more...
Well, my English grandfather, who fought in North Africa with the RAF in North Africa, when I was a kid in the 70s and in the early 80s, he didn't talk much about the war and stuff. But if there was something Rommel mentioned on TV, he had nothing but respect for Rommel. You know, and that is his enemy and stuff. He certainly didn't have respect for Hitler.
Yeah.
And as a quote from his wife, my grandmother, when my oldest cousin had a German girlfriend in the 80s, and Grandma was very much against it. And I even asked Grandma, I'm like, why? What's wrong with Birgit? She seems nice. And Grandma, so Grandpa had respect for Rommel. This was what Grandma thought of Germans. Oh, you guys are German. This will be fun. This is a word-for-word quote. But you don't understand. The Germans are the dirtiest, filthiest people ever to inhabit the face of the earth. That's what my grandma said to like 14-year-old me. So, but Grandpa still had nothing but respect for Rommel.
Right?
Oh, yeah. Grandma's never wrong. She's Grandma.
No, I think that I would add to that at least at this point, the war in North Africa is just a war. When the war bogs down, and it does at the end of this period, it kind of locks down, and then the Germans come in, and then there's a little brief period of action. They're stuck in the desert. Let's not forget that.
Yeah.
This is really a very harsh environment. It's not just the war that is killing them. It's the heat. It's the lack of water. It's the lack of supplies. It's a really bad place to be. And inside of that situation, there are glimpses of humanity. We have the cooperation between Germans and British forces, in as much as that they closed down the war for a couple of hours of the day in order to give everybody a chance to recover, get rid of the sand in their equipment and the sand in their bodies and drink some water. They even exchange goods with each other because you cannot survive on your own in the desert. It's as simple as that. And even your enemy is a source for survival. So there's it's so easy to say that it's a higher cause, but it's also a consequence of where we are fighting.
But that's very interesting. So those things are symbolic of even with our enemy, we're in this together, because something about the war in Africa, North and East Africa, this first year stuff, there is a bunch of symbolism, even though to people in Germany and Britain stuff, it's just some faraway place. What do I care about what's going on in Italian Somaliland? But when British Somaliland fell in 1940, that means Britain lost a colony. That was a real morale hit right during the Battle of Britain. They're the guys that get colonies. They're not the guys that lose colonies. So that was a massive thing. Also, though, the first British victory of the war was the victory in the the East African campaign, although that's in 1941. And that was a massive morale boost just when you really needed a massive morale boost. So you can think of it, there's a lot of symbolism of the war in Africa at this moment in 1940.
Okay. The Italian army.
Yes.
As useless as it's often portrayed, or is that being too harsh?
It's a little unfair. The problem, there were two real problems with the Italian army in 1940. One, which is a lesser problem, is that they had fantastic equipment, unbelievable guns, but they were artisanal guns. They were made in small batches. They didn't have the massive industry to pump out 500,000 rifles. So what they had was fantastic, but they had to supplement that with a bunch of crap, which wasn't fair. And a lot of the reason for that is the Italian army was not ready for war. Italian soldiers fought just fine in a lot of battles, right? And they were led okay too. That's unfair too. But the Italian army was not nearly ready for war. When Mussolini decided that they were going to invade Greece, and that's in October 1940. Now, he needs, 20-something divisions to do the job? Just ferrying them across to Albania is estimated to take 3 or 4 months. He wants the war to begin on October 26th. That's 11 days from now. So you already know it's going to be a disaster. And the divisions had been reorganized. They were now 1 regiment short each, so he could keep up the number of divisions, because they had been demobilizing the army in the years leading up to the war, because he wasn't, they were just fighting in Abyssinia and stuff. There wasn't the big plan for, we're going to take all the British territory, we're going to take Greece. Had he spent another year and waited, especially till Germany had its hands full in the Soviet Union, maybe the war in Greece would have had a completely different outcome, and maybe the war in North Africa would have had a completely different outcome because he would have had a much better army with full divisions and maybe some mass production equipment. I mean, Operation Compass at the end of 1940 was a huge disaster for Italy. I mean, they lost an entire army, the Italian 10th Army. That's like 150,000 men taken captive, which means the British have to deal with all those guys and stuff, which was a great victory for Britain. And the British lost a few thousand men, you know. So it wasn't they were useless, it's they were nowhere near ready for this war when this war began.
I'm going to venture into the area of pure speculation now for a moment, right? And also spoilers for anybody who's still following the series and hasn't seen our conclusion, War Numbers, which sums up the whole war. This war was decided in a completely different place than on the battlefield. This war was decided in the factories, in the wallet, the economies of the world. With 2020 hindsight, we know that the Axis stood no chance to win this war because they were outproduced, they were outperformed in economy, in all aspects. That were
resources.
Resources. Everything that was off the battlefield, which then ends up on the battlefield. So it was just a question of time before they lose, right? And Italy, in very many ways, shows us that. And it's a microcosm of exactly what happened there. Contrary to Germany, like Indy just said, they had not been gearing up for a massive war. They had not been doing a super armament program. They had not been massively beefing up the forces with people. And here we simply see what happens to the Axis forces when faced with the overwhelming opposition of the Allied war machine. And it also shows us that had not Hitler done all of the terrible things he did in the 1930s, which were terrible not only to the world, but also to his own economy, then the war would have been over much faster. This is a terrible, wasteful effort. And what happens to the Italian army is not that they lose because they are poorer soldiers or worse soldiers or not good fighting men or lacking in morale. What happens to them is that they face the music far faster than the rest of the Axis nations.
That's moving on from the army to a part of the Japanese military that is regarded as very capable, the Navy. Did the strike, the Royal Navy strike at Taranto, inspire the Japanese to attack Pearl Harbor?
Unquestionably.
Definitely.
The very next day, Isoroku Yamamoto was already looking at that and thinking, ha 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 ha. There's no other answer to that except yes.
And for anybody who doesn't know, the strike on Taranto is the first time that we see real action by aircraft carriers.
Planes from aircraft carriers destroying ships in a harbor from a long way away in a surprise assault. Basically,
sounds
just
familiar?
What Pearl Harbor, basically Pearl Harbor.
But a long time before Pearl Harbor,
it inspired Yamamoto definitely.
Yeah. Great, and I guess now to a more overarching question: Mussolini in Italy, from the German perspective and 2020 hindsight, is it a net gain or a net loss for Germany?
Well, obviously, it's going to come across as a net loss because everything was a net loss. But you know, I mentioned in the last episode that Neville Chamberlain was saying there's no point having a brokered peace through Italy because as soon as France falls, Italy's going to declare war on Britain. And of course, that's exactly what happened, which started this whole war in the Mediterranean. Mussolini, I mean, Hitler was really pissed off when he found out that Mussolini was going to declare war on Germany, or had declared war on Germany. There's dispute whether or not Hitler knew in advance, or how much in advance. If you go back through our regular episodes, I mentioned several different historians have different perspectives on that. That was really stupid. If Mussolini had just waited, it could have been a completely different story. But he was very much a drain.
You meant Greece just now, right?
I mean, yeah, invade Greece. Sorry.
Yeah, because you said declared war on Germany. So for a second, I was
sorry.
like, what the f*** am I missing? This is huge news.
So that's why it was a drain. Of course it was a drain. The Africa Corps would not have been sent to Africa in the beginning of 1941 without Mussolini. Yeah. There would have been more troops available for invading the Soviet Union. All stuff like that.
I can't help but see the irony in what you just said, because this war was very much fought on the basis of megalomaniacs declaring war on forces that they could never win against. chief megalomaniac among them was probably Mr. Hitler.
Yeah.
So Herr Hitler is now pissed off because somebody else
He's being a megalomaniac.
does the same
But it's
thing.
but it's not working for the other guy.
I guess that's why he's pissed
Well, it
off.
didn't work for Hitler either.
So
Well,
it's
in the
true,
beginning,
it's-
yes, spoiler
true.
alert, guys. Yeah.
So
Okay, and now a question to wrap up this whole time frame that we've been talking about in this one, the last one, and the previous Fireside chat.
okay.
What is, in both of your opinions, the most overlooked event of, let's say, 1939 and 1940?
Most overlooked thing that happened or
Yeah.
thing that failed to happen.
It doesn't also have to be the most. It can just be or an often overlooked.
Because you see a lot of the watershed moments are, they are well known, and we've hyped up things like Hunziker withdrawing the troops. That's a specific moment. That's not just a German breakthrough. That's one guy doing a specific thing that changed the course of the war.
I have one answer to that. And
Go ahead.
that's Inside of the War Against Humanity. And it's not really so much an overlooked event, but a underplayed event and a misunderstood event. And that is the actions of the SS in Poland, both in the extermination efforts that they had against Polish intelligentsia, but also the actually ghettoization of the Jewish population of Poland. This is often, and especially among people who want to kind of downplay the horror of Nazism, which is disgraceful to even try to do that.
Disgusting.
But anybody who looks at that and doesn't understand that this is the first step in extermination is simply kidding themselves, because that is what it is. And therefore, the whole debate, but no, they didn't want to kill them. They wanted to just move them out, and they wanted to move them to Madagascar. It was all about extermination. And this was a preparation for what would come the year after, in 1941, when the Holocaust begins in earnest. And that is often overlooked. And it's not just overlooked or downplayed in modern terms. That was also what happened at the time. People were viewing this as something, it's terrible, maybe. But you're just locking them up. It couldn't be such a big deal. So I think it's really important for us to understand Nazism and the horror of Nazism, to accept the fact that this was not a different thing. This was part of the same plan. And that's something that I think is often, at least
That's a
underrepresented.
good one. That's a great one. I'll still go with specifically Hunziker withdrawing the French, when who knows what would have happened otherwise. Maybe they would have broken through eventually, but that would have taken several more days.
Yeah.
It wouldn't have happened the way it happened.
And we're almost done here, but one last question just came in at the last second. What's flabbergast mean?
In terms of World War, you mean the word flabbergast?
Yeah, I don't know why this is on here, but
Yeah, I got it. Sure. It's interesting. You remember the last time when I was talking about buffoonery, and it had to do with the
Tyler Buffoon?
Tyler Buffoon. I'm glad you remembered his first name. I didn't. But flabbergast, actually, the word flabbergast and flabbergasted actually also has to go with another American president, Ulysses P. Flabber, in the early 1840s. Now, a lot of people don't know this, but John Tyler was never actually president of the United States. People think John Tyler was. People think that when William Henry Harrison died, in 1841, Tyler, as his vice president, succeeded him. That's not true. It was Ulysses Flabber. Now, this has been erased from history, right? Because, during this time, well, yes, but I have to tell you why. I have to decide why first. During this time, there was a big crisis because the U.S. was deciding if we were going to have a national bank. Some people were for it, some people weren't. As it turns out, as we know, we don't have a national bank, right? And there was Hiram Gast, who was a senator from Pennsylvania, right? Gast and Flabber got together and made the Flabbergast Act, right? And the Flabbergast Act was intended to ram through support in the Senate, like pull in all the favors, to create a national bank. And this was so offensive because, it was a time when there was plenty of partisan stuff, but, people were still very much gentlemen at the time. Sure. They were actually called. The act failed, and Flabber was impeached, and not only impeached, he was erased from history. So very few historians actually know about Ulysses P. Flabber and Hiram Gast and the Flabbergast Act of 1841. But the Senate said they were flabbergasted because they were stunned by this act that was being rammed down their throats in order to create a national bank. And while we don't remember Hiram Gast and Ulysses P. Flabber these days, their names still live on from the Flabbergast Act of 1841, which flabbergasted the Senate and now flabbergasted the world. And
Great.
there you have it. That's the story.
That's things you didn't know until you met Indy.
Look, when you grow up, be a historian, because then you'll know all this stuff. You'll know all of these things, and you'll be able to explain it rationally and reasonably to all your friends. But Sparty, Sebastian, thank you very much for today, for another fantastic fireside chat. We're going to do more of these in the future, right?
Absolutely.
We got more. Okay, and Clara, thank you very much too. All right, you guys, we'll see you later. Excelsior!